Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, as liquid chlorine converted to a gas that spread in all directions, drivers on the highway were among the first to encounter the toxic cloud. We now continue with Part 1, Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3, Back to Nature. Lucinda Hodges thought Alberton the town that time forgot. In 1986, the year her son Trask was born, 26-year-old Hodges moved to the rugged country near Sawmill Gulch after leaving the university in Missoula and getting married. She didn't want to raise kids downwind of the Frenchtown pulp mill, infamous for fouling Missoula air with its sulfur emissions. Within a couple years, they bought the old mercantile in Alberton on Railroad Avenue, which had stood abandoned for 5 years. After the Milwaukee Railroad disintegrated, everything seemed for sale in Alberton, cheap as faded memories. By 1912, the Lothrop sawmill at Petty Creek was shut down and the Northern Pacific Railroad closed their station. As one old-timer put it, after booming 20 years, the Montana frontier town went back to nature. Many people relocated across the river, downstream 2 miles to a fledgling operation created by the expanding Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway Company, the Milwaukee Road. The Milwaukee built a railroad yard and station with a depot and an 8-stall roundhouse, then sold platted lots that sprouted general stores and houses. Courtesy of Albert J. Erling, president of the Milwaukee, brand new Alberton was the quintessential railroad town USA, headquarters of the Missoula Division. The first passenger train arrived on July 19, 1909. By 1910, Alberton boasted 400 residents, a little more than it would 90 years later. Alberton was the railroad. Besides moneymaker freight, passenger trains made 4 daily stops, and restaurants, bars, and hotels sprang up. Virtually everyone in Alberton depended on the Milwaukee for their livelihood or well-being. A mutually prosperous way of life, this relationship lay at the heart of the loyalty and sentiment that old-timers still embraced in 1996. Though Alberton diversified a bit over time, it remained essentially a railroad town, dependent on the corporate health of the Milwaukee Road. Through changes in technology and economics, the Milwaukee ebbed and flowed for decades, eventually dying by degrees. The Milwaukee slipped into its third and final bankruptcy in the 1970s, and by 1978, deferred maintenance dictated a mandatory reduction in speed. Derailments happened daily. In a symbolic farewell in March 1980, the last train crept at the allowable 10 miles per hour on the dilapidated track from Tarkio bound for Alberton, but died en route on failed rail. Charlie Rock, an old Milwaukee veteran, was aboard that stranded train. He sailed the Silver Ribbon for 43 years. That was the saddest day of our life, Rock's wife Elsie recalled. After 70 years of throbbing with the pulse of trains, the heart of Alberton ceased to beat. Unemployment skyrocketed, and Mineral County lost $1 million tax base, but the loss cut deeper than economics. Generations had defined themselves as one with the railroad and found themselves abandoned, adrift, and bereft, and betrayed. Many workers bitterly denounced Milwaukee management for the demise. Scores of employees sold their homes and left. As the track was torn up and the depot boarded over, people wondered if the town would go the way of old Lothrop, withered and forgotten. The end of the line for the Milwaukee signaled true depression. For the first time in people's memories, empty houses marred the town, dead satellites of a mute depot. Then, in 1983, Alberton received a federal grant to rehabilitate about a fifth of its 130 homes to attract new buyers and allow the town to purchase the grounds of the former rail yard to develop a town park. Alberton purchased and rehabilitated the depot, which became home to the Senior Citizen Center and town offices, a renewed cornerstone of the town. As some wounds began to heal, remaining townsfolk embraced Alberton's heritage anew, knowing it would otherwise be lost. A local civic group organized the first Railroad Day celebration in 1986, held the third Saturday of every July with its signature parade. Even as Montana increasingly marketed its most enduring value of natural beauty, Alberton began a shift in economy that included tourism. Back to nature. For many people, history too was an attraction, and Alberton had both assets in spades. Though some former Milwaukee employees went to work for the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, unemployment remained high. Then, in 1987, BNSF sold its Montana operations to a new company, Montana Rail Link, owned by billionaire Missoulian Dennis Washington. Some locals referred to MRL as Milwaukee Railroad Lives. But unlike the Milwaukee, which had run through the beating heart of Alberton and infused it with blood, MRL tracks lay distant across the river. We the willing, led by the unknowing, are doing the impossible for the ungrateful. We have done so much for so long with so little, we are now qualified to do anything with nothing. Sign hung in the Alberton Depot in 1980. Hodges had little money, but sought a place to sink roots. Instead of pain and loss, Alberton seemed a golden opportunity, and she liked the feel of community. She was young, the world ripe with possibility. Built around 1910 by the Milwaukee, the false-fronted two-story house she bought retained quaint character with a historic resume to match. Originally a speakeasy and dance hall, it evolved into the Mercantile, with a sign proclaiming the Whistle Stop. When Hodges bought it in 1988, the Merc was the last empty business establishment in Alberton. She made it her home. I paid $10,000 for my house, she said. Things were that cheap. I didn't have any money. I just thought I was lucky to figure out a way to buy a home. Hodges thought Alberton on the rebound, her family filling the last little vacant hole. But the economy was still depressed. She estimated unemployment at about 50% when she relocated. After the Milwaukee's demise, much of the younger townsfolk scattered, leaving behind railroad retirees. Many newcomers either used Alberton as a bedroom community and commuted 30 miles to Missoula, or had entitlement income to help out. But much of Alberton was made up of folks like her, low-income working class. After her second son Jesse was born, Hodges' marriage failed, but she stayed on, marrying local Mark Hanson, a large man who worked in construction. By 1995, Hodges had become president of the Alberton Valley Association, the local civic group, whose motto was, "Working together to build a better community." Some of the new blood had ideas of making Alberton a better place, she said. We had a little visitor center going. We were writing grants to try to get playground equipment and to preserve the historical integrity of Alberton and make it more attractive, I guess. She converted one of the front rooms of her big house into the AVA Visitor Center that summer. The AVA started as an economic development group and had initiated the annual railroad days and supported the local railroad museum. Hodges thought of them as a fun group, but after she got involved, she and some like-minded friends wanted the AVA to help preserve some of the older buildings, to draw in visitors. For out-of-towners, Alberton was barely a gas stop, but many visitors complained they couldn't get information about the area. Seeing untapped tourism potential, Hodges offered a packet with maps and local history, a list of 10 things to do while visiting Alberton, such as float the Alberton Gorge, see Big Pine, the oldest ponderosa in Montana, just up Fish Creek. Simple, but a start. She collaborated with Superior County to try a welfare-to-work program for volunteers. She had lots of ideas. Not everyone shared her enthusiasm. Despite the economic doldrums, the town reacted surprisingly negatively to what she thought positive change. I guess I've always been controversial since I've lived in Alberton, she said. People were upset that I had welfare workers working as volunteers in the visitor center because those were white trash people, Hodges recalled. I looked at it as job training, that we were giving them an opportunity. That kind of attitude just didn't go over very well. The old-timers didn't need jobs. They were very upset with the visitor center, she said. They were very upset about my ideas about grant writing. We got public restrooms in the park, and that was a huge debate because, as they said at the town council, Howard Hogan said, he doesn't want foreigners peeing in Alberton. So we couldn't get him to open the doors, she laughed, about the man in charge of the keys. And that's what they called them in Alberton, foreigners, she said. This broad designation included Missoulians. It was really hard to get used to Alberton, Hodges said. For a stranger, walking down Railroad Avenue was like being on a stage. But I think we were slowly making ground, she said. You gotta let people pee in your public restrooms. After living in the area 10 years, Hodges only now felt she was building a core group of friends. Younger people with good ideas, like herself and neighbors Deb Griffin and Deb Giannicaro, all in their 30s, wanted a voice too. Giannicaro ran for city council, but lost to the old guard. Hodges thought maybe 70% of the people still had railroad connections, including pensioners. But Hodges foresaw the changing of the guard. They were going to make it a better town. I intended to live there the rest of my life, and I thought I was building something and taking my time, something that would provide a wonderful lifestyle for my kids and for me that we could have for 20, 30 years, that they would have this cute little town to grow up in. It'd be clean, affordable beauty. Yet, Alberton had its dark side. In July of 1995, a man with a pistol took 4 women captive in Chet's bar on a Friday night, firing off 8 rounds as he herded others out, threatening to kill anyone who challenged him. Hodges had just come home and heard gunfire and called 911 as people ran out of the next door bar. Both Mineral and Missoula SWAT teams arrived, taking over her house. Eventually, the man let everyone go and shot himself dead. The owner washed the blood out and opened the bar right back up. I felt like I was at the hub of something weird all the time, Hodges said. Alberton definitely was ingrown, and they have not accepted any kind of change, which didn't bode well for a town subject to a lot of hard change. In 1996, a typical day began by getting her kids off to school. Jessie, almost 7, had started first grade the previous fall. Trask was 9. Hodges would spend the morning cleaning house, splitting wood for the stove. She almost always shared a lunch with the kids at school. She might have a half work day at the local tax office. Later, she enjoyed taking the kids down to the river after school. The Natural Pier Bridge 2 miles west was their favorite spot with its fishing access and small beach. Tying her long, dirty blonde hair into a ponytail, she would run the dog, run the kids, get some fresh air, come back, and fix dinner. The family had just purchased a hot tub, and that was a big deal. Mark had joined the laborers' union that winter, and in April started a major highway job, the redoing of the I-90 bridges. It was a big change because he had always worked on the road, often out of state. Now he committed to the union and area work to keep closer to his family. But the new start was tough financially because winter projects had been sparse. Lucinda and Mark had been married 2 years, and despite the struggles, everything seemed to be coming together in the spring of 1996. On April 10, Hanson had been working the nearby 9 Mile Bridge site for a couple days when the crew took a hiatus to wait for heavy rain to stop. The next day began the worst year of Hodges' life, when she and her family were gassed by a toxic cloud that sent the entire town fleeing in the middle of the night. For Alberton, history abruptly clouded in the dark throat of the canyon. Chapter 4. Worst Case Scenario. By sheer coincidence, in 1995, the annual Emergency Preparedness Training for Missoula County Disaster Response Agencies was a chlorine leak simulation. Missoula Sheriff's Deputy Willis Hintz said responders generally look for some kind of disaster that's going to tax, overload, and burden the system so they can test it, he said. The Incident Command System. The chosen scenario was a chlorine tank leak at the Frenchtown Stone Container Pulp Mill, halfway between Missoula and Alberton. The mill used nearly 5,000 tons of liquid chlorine a year in its bleaching process, over 55 rail tanks. Participants learned about chlorine being heavier than air and that water knocked it down but turned it into hydrochloric acid. They learned about creating a hot zone and how the gas would move downwind, downhill, downstream. The simulation incident commander was Scott Waldron, chief of the Frenchtown Fire Department. Waldron thought the scenario prepared us better for the Alberton derailment, he said. But in after-action debriefing, Hintz recalled a big complaint was poor communication between agencies, a problem that remained the following spring. Firefighter Jess Mickelson, a team leader for Missoula County Hazmat Operations, emphasized the stone container scenario was for a small valve leak from a tank, not a catastrophic rupture. You can't really train for a worst-case scenario, Mickelson allowed. No one really expected the worst. But they might have. The EPA cited chlorine as the leading cause of deaths and injuries among significant hazardous material incidents. In 1995, MRL hauled 2,227 loads of chlorine, 6 chlorine tanks per day, passing through Montana towns. Hazmat accidents were rare, but these rolling time bombs could detonate anywhere, anytime. Communities like Alberton and Missoula gave little thought to such freight. Hintz recalled the attitude of the time. The chlorine tanks out there would never rupture, never ever have to worry about a chlorine spill of that magnitude, he said. I wish I would have taken better notes, Hintz lamented, and paid better attention, because, God. The worst-case scenario for a chlorine release, according to the Chlorine Institute, was that a 90-ton rupture could spread gas vast distances, up to 40 miles. Missoula lay 30 miles east of Alberton, in an extended valley home to over 60,000 people. The University of Nevada pegged a worst-case scenario for a 90-ton chlorine release in Las Vegas, Nevada, as killing about 91,000 people. Real-life events had already offered sobering lessons. In the deadly 1978 Youngstown, Florida derailment, an estimated 30 tons of liquid chlorine created a massive cloud. 8 people died, motorists, but the EPA wrote, had the accident occurred 2 miles either way, deaths would have been in the hundreds. A major pipe leak in 1991 in Henderson, Nevada at the Pioneer Chlor-Alkali plant sent 300 people to hospitals with 10,000 evacuated. Reported problems included lack of a widespread evacuation plan, ineffective communications, unprotected responders, and lax decontamination procedures. Alberton responders were about to learn the same painful lessons. Most responders didn't plan for a worst-case chlorine scenario, but they could rely on general developed protocols in the event of toxic disasters. In a hazmat emergency, the Responder's Bible was the Federal Department of Transportation Emergency Response Guidebook, ERG, to quickly identify a hazard. The responder looked up the chemical of concern and a recommended zone for initial evacuations, which also depended on the time of day and area winds. Missoula firefighter John Fiddler said of initial zones, "This is only good for the first half hour to an hour, and then all bets are off." The guidelines were no substitute for real-time concentration data, which was hard to get. Another key consideration was whether to evacuate or shelter in place. Either could make sense if it prevented any or worse exposure. But uncertainty often ruled, a classic catch-22 under bad circumstances. Exposed if you run, and exposed if you don't. Next came an on-scene assessment by hazmat experts to evaluate the evacuation zone, followed by delineation of the hot, warm, and cold zones. Then came dealing with the spill at the site. Protocol emphasized safety. Responders were urged to avoid rushing in and to have protection. For a toxic inhalation hazard such as chlorine gas, the ERG warned, toxic, may be fatal if inhaled or absorbed through skin. Responders also had access to the MSDS on chlorine, material safety data sheets, from various sources, including MRL as a transporter. An MSDS would have told responders about the basic health hazards of acute chlorine exposure, such as chlorine gas could cause severe irritation to the eyes, nose, and respiratory tract, and severe exposures may be fatal. The key messages for initial responders: chlorine gas is highly toxic, potentially deadly. Chlorine gas is highly irritative, often even at low levels. Remove victims from exposure, followed by decontamination. And responders without protection risk becoming victims of chlorine gas. A ruptured chlorine tank was a catastrophic public health crisis. Initially, Alberton responders didn't know how much chlorine had spilled or from how many tanks. They didn't know if other chemicals had spilled. They didn't know what chlorine concentrations they faced. In fact, initial responders to the Alberton chlorine spill didn't even know where the spill was. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, The True Story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.